afternoon, everyone, and thanks for coming. As I'm just looking at you all, like as we're getting ready, and I'm kind of reminded of the first time I went to an accessibility talk. I kind of sat there in the audience. It was my first accessibility talk. It was maybe 2014, and I remember feeling like it was all very nice and very, stuff that we should probably be doing, but. I kept hearing about like keyboard accessibility, and I thought, well, maybe if I was starting a new thing, but for the thing that I'm building, it probably doesn't apply. And I was there with my team from an old job, and we were like, yeah, this probably doesn't apply to us, but it's nice, but it's probably not for a project. So it's that kind of feeling of accessibility being somewhere over there, and the stuff that we were doing being somewhere over here, and this sort of disconnect. And it's, nowadays I kind of do this work very often. It's kind of embarrassing to look back and say, oh, that's where I was. But it kind of gives me, kind of helps me appreciate kind of being in that place, because it's just very easy to kind of be a developer and not be aware of these things. Just kind of that feeling of accessibility is kind of far away from what I'm doing. So fast forward a few years, I started working at the Financial Times. At that time, we were migrating from an old website, from, 10-year-old website, to the current website that we have now. It was like the greatest, fastest news site in the industry at the time, and I think still today. It took about 2 years to build, and we released it to great success, replaced this old website, and we started winning a bunch of awards. We're excelling in performance and security, and basically every metric that we had set our sights on, we were excelling at. So one day we decided to look at accessibility, because maybe we were just good at this too, by like magic. But unlike performance or security, we had never put any collective effort into accessibility. So to no one's surprise, we weren't very good. And since this talk is all about the lessons that we learned while we were building ft.com, that was really the first lesson that we learned, like right at the start. Accessibility doesn't just happen, you have to make it happen. My name is Laura Carvajal. I'm a principal engineer at the Financial Times. This is an actual picture of our building. It's a magical place with a rainbow and everything. For the better part of 2017, I was the lead of the accessibility team for ft.com, so the team that builds the main website for the newspaper. Today I work in a team called Internal Products, where we build like products for our employees. So basically, I spend my day building stuff for myself, and then someone pays me for that, which is a pretty good deal. But today I want to tell you about kind of the lessons that we learned while we were building ft.com. And once we realized that we were building this beautiful performant thing, but it couldn't be enjoyed by everyone. So in case you're in that place where you're wondering if accessibility applies to your project or not, hopefully today you'll walk away convinced that it does, and that it's fairly easy to get started. Is this thing coming kind of in and out? Can you hear me properly? All right. Okay, so what is accessibility? You'll find many definitions out there, and one that's fairly common is this one. It just says accessibility means that people with disabilities can use the web. I kind of like this one because it's simple, kind of oversimplifies things, but it's a good place to get started. Basically boils things down to making sure we're not denying access to anyone to the thing that we're building. And to kind of go beyond this a little bit, I want to tell you a quick story. I was in this shopping mall in London where I live with I was in here with my daughter. And we were going to go up those escalators that you see there. And as we were going up those escalators, my daughter asks me, so how does someone in a wheelchair do what we're doing now? And I said, well, there's a lift, kind of like a knee-jerk reaction. And she looked around. She's 10. She looked around and said, where's the lift? And I looked around as well, and I couldn't see it. It took us getting all the way up to the next level to notice that at the other end of that long hallway, there was a lift indeed. So my daughter said, well, someone in a wheelchair would have to go all the way there and up, and then all the way back to do what we just did very quickly. And kids have a way of seeing things for what they are. And she was right. I mean, obviously, this is a fairly modern shopping mall. It's it has complies with all the regulations. But she was right. It was unfair. The kind of the access was unfair. So I kind of like to expand on that previous definition with beyond not denying access to anyone. We need to make sure that the access that we're providing is fair to anyone that visits your site. And I kind of like to give credit to my daughter for that quote. So we talked about accessibility, and we briefly mentioned the word disability. So I'd like to look at that a little bit more. So we can roughly categorize disability in these 4 groups: physical, visual, hearing, and cognitive. So while we may be more familiar with permanent disabilities, like someone being deaf or hard of hearing, we also have temporary disabilities and situational disabilities. So those closed captions that benefit a deaf person on a video that you may put out also benefit every one of us while we're in that spectrum. So, and I like to say us because each and every one of us spend time on that spectrum at some point during our daily lives. So you may have other reasons for wanting to watch like a breaking news video without audio. So it's not really an us and them thing. Fixing accessibility on your site will benefit everyone. So it's really not this other people that we're doing this for, it's for all of us. But as far as permanent disabilities go, there's about 1 billion people in the world, it's about 15% of the population, that have a disability. And when you factor in your user base and their demographics, you'll get a clear picture of what that number is for your product and for your company. When we did that, it worked out to be potentially 26% of our users, factoring it in the age distribution of the readership of the Financial Times, who tends to skew a little bit older. That's the number that we got. So we in our team, in the FT.com team, and I'm sure a lot of you as well in your teams spend a lot of time making sure that the products that you're building can be used by, say if it's a web product that you're building, can be used not only by users on Chrome, but hopefully users also on Firefox and other browsers, and even IE 8 or 9 or whatever it is. I think we support up down to IE 9. Last I worked on that team, and it was probably 4% of our users, but we always made sure that those users were served some kind of experience. If they visited our site, they could see something, they could read articles, they could sign in, etc. So now, once we had these numbers, we realized that potentially we had 26% of our audience who just wasn't getting that experience. So that, when you put things in numbers like this, it tends to be a good motivator to get things started. So let's say if I'm pitching this to you, let's say I've convinced you now, and you're determined to do this, and you're going to fix accessibility on your site, and you're going to be the very best, and it's scary and overwhelming, and there's just a lot out there, you don't know where to start. So our suggestion is just start small. That's what we did. And for us, starting small meant doing this. We installed Pali. And Pali is an open source tool that checks your markup and automatically detects some accessibility errors that you may have. It doesn't detect everything, but it's a really good place to start, especially if you're not doing anything yet in terms of checking for accessibility on your site. The way it works is it goes through the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, which is a list of criteria that that websites need to meet to be accessible. So it checks your markup against every item on the checklist, and it gives you a list of what's broken. So we did that. We ran literally the Pali command in the terminal, like you see here. We ran it for FT.com. The first time we ran it, I didn't take a screenshot, but it was about 200 errors. This is just 2 errors, but initially we had a couple hundred errors in there. So you run it, it tells you what's broken on your site, and you could go about manually fixing everything that it finds, and then running it again periodically, and then fixing it over and over. But for a site of the size of FT.com, this really wasn't efficient. So that's when Pali CI came in. It's developed by the same open source team, and what it does is just wraps Pali so that it integrates with your CI process. There are other tools that kind of work in the same way that you could use, but we found Pali to be just very easy to use, and it's supported by a great team of people, very hardworking, and whenever we had any questions or issues or pull requests, they were always there. They do this on their own time, like a lot of people doing open source. But I don't know, it was easy to use, and it was supported by a great team. So I highly recommend it. If you haven't had a look at any of these tools, just have a look at this one. It's really well supported. So I want to show you what this looks like in our project. This is kind of a simplified view, overly simplified view of how ft.com is built. We have a bunch of Node apps that make up our site. So our front page will be a Node app, an article page, the sign-up page. Each of those is a different app. I want to say it's about 2 dozen, a little bit more. And they all live in GitHub. Whenever you push to a branch, that gets built in CI, in Circle CI. And if that branch is master, then it gets pushed to Heroku, where it goes live immediately to production. So Pali kicks in at this step, the CI step. It runs on every push of every branch that you make, and it tells you right away if you have accessibility errors on that branch. So to do that, to integrate it with our process, the only thing we had to do is this, just a single extra line in our build process that we already had. And what that did was just call Pali CI. In our case, that it can be configured a little bit further, because we have, for every branch that we create, it automatically creates a test app in Heroku. So Pali had to run against that. So we needed to tell Pali, this is the URL for the app, and run Pali against that live app. And there's an interesting bit here, is the threshold argument. So this tells Pali to run and to allow up to that number of errors without breaking the build. So this was really important as we were starting out, because we have, I think at the time we had 20-something developers, each of them working on their thing, creating their branch. We couldn't all of a sudden break everyone's build and expect everyone to stop to start fixing this thing. So what we did was kind of silently, 2 or 3 of us silently included Pali into all of our build processes. And every time you push to a branch, whatever branch it was, it would start telling you the errors that you had, but it wouldn't break your build because it was allowing up to 100 errors. Our ultimate goal here was to actually break those builds, but again, we couldn't really stop the work that everyone was doing, especially because it was around the time that we were releasing this new version of the site to the public, which was kind of a big deal. But the way we went about this was, since we have a couple dozen apps, we took one by one, a small team of us in the larger ft.com team, and we started fixing the bugs, in the accessibility bugs in each of these apps. And by the time we got to 0, we removed that threshold argument. So for that particular app, if a new branch was created and introduced new accessibility errors, in that case it would break, and you would get your build wouldn't pass. So by that time, that app was kind of clean and ready to go, and we moved on to the next ones, and we did that for I don't know, around 30 applications. And by the time we were done with all that, kind of felt like winners. Like, yes, we've made it. We've kind of cleaned up all of our apps and kind of secure them so that no more accessibility errors could kind of seek into production. But we realized that even though everyone was kind of supportive of this new Pali thing that we had introduced to the team, they knew what it was, they knew what it did, and kind of the purpose of fixing accessibility, and everyone was kind of excited to having their builds break if they were introducing errors. But we didn't do a great job of explaining what they needed to do once their builds broke, because you would get error, you would get the errors are, you kind of need to be familiar with what the errors that can be thrown so you can do something about them. So that's something that we could have done better. And also how, once you get the error, what do you have to do to fix it. So that was lesson number 2 that we learned. Before you set the build on fire, you have to kind of train people. It's kind of twofold. You can training courses and workshops to kind of explain what accessibility is about and what to expect with these things. But also like specifics around what Pali would find and then what that would look like in their building, what they were supposed to do. So yeah, in terms of what Pali could find, so if I could go back and kind of do this over again, I would go over this whole thing with my team, kind of what is Pali going to find. So having done this with the team over the course of about 6 months, if I could say like the single most common error that we had everywhere was contrast issues. So the specification says that any text that you have over any background on your site is supposed to have a contrast ratio of 4.5 to 1, so that you can actually read it. And this is our old footer. And it turns out that light gray on top of less light gray isn't very easy to read. So even though our designers had designed it like this and it looked fine to everyone, it didn't pass any of the tests. So all we had to do was kind of tweak the colors a little bit with the design team until they were happy and the tests were passing. And so that's it. So things like that footer were everywhere, colors of links over different types of backgrounds. So that one is very common. And that's very straightforward for something like Pali to catch. So, so yeah, that check will get rid of a lot of errors for you. I would say contender number 2 was images that didn't have alt text. So in our site, we have different types of images. We have a lot of the articles have kind of like a topper image. It's kind of decorative. In that case, you don't really need to set any. Let me see if I have it here. No. So for images that don't have alt text, you just basically need to set alt attribute to something if it's an image that provides content. But if it's an image that's just decoration, you can set the alt text to empty and the role of the image to presentation. So that way screen readers and other assistive tech would just ignore the image. That for images that are for decoration only. But if you have an image that actually is part of the content that tells a story, then just give it an alt and that description. So if you're going through the page with a screen reader, you'll know what that image was there, rather than if you don't do any of that, you will read, if you're going through the site with a screen reader, you will hear image.jpg. That kind of doesn't tell you very much. So yeah, don't forget the alt text and make it explicitly empty if it's just a decorative image. Another common one, we have a couple forms on the site, and it's this here. So you have fields with labels, like I'm sure a lot of you have built on all your products, and you probably have used for an ID to relate a label to an input, which is really nice. And like if we're not thinking about accessibility, it seems like semantically nice, but it's if we forget to do one of these in a form, you don't really see anything break on screen. So for us, that happened. We had a couple of fields that had the for and the ID didn't match, or there was a for missing somewhere. So for screen readers, this is really vital, because if you're going through the page with a screen reader, just reading out what's on there, if you don't have that relationship, you might hear input. And that's it. You're expected to enter text in an input, and you don't know what you're meant to enter. So just setting these is just really valuable to screen readers. If you do it correctly, you will hear email address input, so you know what you have to enter in that text. Another thing was required fields. We tended to indicate, like in our old version of the form, fields that were required with just an asterisk. And we didn't really do it in the markup. We didn't have that required there, so we had all our validation done in JavaScript anyway. So yeah, if you're using assistive technology to read the page, it doesn't. If you're filling in the fields, you don't really know what's required and what isn't. You might hear out email address star, and screen reader users kind of used to this thing. So if they hear the star, okay, it's a required field. But it's kind of a workaround. If you actually put the attribute required on the field, they will immediately hear that's a required field. So yeah, even if you have JavaScript validation or any other kind of validation, just don't forget the old JavaScript HTML markup. Ads are fun. Ads are problematic for many ways, but for accessibility in particular, they're a big challenge because it's a bunch of HTML and God knows what else injected into your page, and you just have to deal with it. So the thing with ads, like banner ads at the top of the page, is that if you're navigating our website without a mouse or without a trackpad, just using the keyboard, like tabbing through, sometimes you would tab onto the ad and be trapped there forever, and you couldn't tab out of the ad. So yeah, that wasn't ideal. And then when we got audited, we failed. That was one of our failures. And we have ads in a lot of our pages because that's part of our business model. So what we did in this case was we hid the ads from assistive technologies, things like screen readers. And a lot of people have asked me, well, if you're hiding the ad from, so this is hiding the ad from people, so that means you're getting less impressions. But if you don't hide it, if you just leave it as it is, and someone lands on it with a screen reader, since the ads are inaccessible, all they'll hear is image and then some random name with numbers and then .jpeg. That's, if it read something nicely like Repsol, click here, then that's different. But none of the ads, no ad that I've ever seen, at least on our site, is accessible in that way. So what we did is just hide it because it doesn't give you anything if you're not looking at it. And we set the tab index to -1 to the ad itself, and then we recursed. Sometimes you have iframe inside an iframe inside an iframe, and you can't really predict how many they're going to be inside your ad. So once the ad's placed on the page, after it's injected, we go through all the iframes that it has and set the tab index to -1. That tells the browser that if you're tabbing through, you're supposed to ignore whatever has that tab index -1. So it basically takes it out of the tab order. So you can't accidentally land on it if you didn't intend to. So yeah, ads are a pain. Hide them from assistive tech if they're not accessible, and they'll likely not be. And tab index -1 gets rid of the problem where you get trapped into the ad. This one's interesting. Having duplicate content on the page. Sometimes you want content to appear twice on the page, like for valid reasons. Let's see. So there's kind of two cases here. When you have two things on the page and they're exactly the same thing. So this is one of our article pages, and at the top right we have latest on Russian politics, because it's an article on Russia, and then some articles are kind of related to the main article, and at the bottom you have the same in a different layout, because that's kind of what our designers and our product team kind of decided that looks like. But it's the same thing. It's latest on Russian politics and the same recommended articles. So if you're going through this page with a screen reader, you obviously don't get that difference in layout. You're reading the article, you hear that there's this thing on the right, and you hear a title and the articles that are recommended there. Then you read the article, and then at the bottom of the page, you read the same thing again. So it's kind of like duplicated content, kind of crowds what the user is hearing. So it's good practice to not have that. But we need to have it visually. So what we did in this case is just leave one. So they're both visible, but set aria hidden true to all but one. So this hides it from assisted technology. So screen readers will only hear, I think in our case, we left the bottom, the one at the bottom, and we hid the one at the top. So you read through the article, and then it said, if you want to read related articles, then these are the articles. So that was our solution there, just setting aria hidden true for all but one of the blocks. You can also have things that look the same on screen, but actually mean different things. So in here we have all those buttons that are essentially the same, but if you're just consuming this visually, you can see they all do different things. They will add Europe or Vladimir Putin or Barack Obama to your MyFT section of the site. But if you're navigating this through a screen reader, there are different modes to navigate. Then there's one mode where you can tell the screen reader, give me all the buttons. What are the buttons on this page? And it will read out add to my FT, add to my FT, add to my FT. And the user can't really, at that point, can't really know which one it is that they want to action. So kind of a simplified version of that button is this. And how we've solved the problem is by adding some context to the name of the button. So this visually hidden class, just make sure that we don't render it on the screen, like whatever's inside of that span. So visually, you still have the same. There's no need to negotiate with your designers that you want the whole thing inside the button. But you still have it, and you're still exposing it to screen reader users. So the buttons now read out add Europe to my FT, add Vladimir Putin to my FT, and users immediately knew which one they needed to click. So we talked about before training people before you break their builds. So knowing what to expect is really important. What to expect in your CI, what things that can break, but also training, like good old training. This is a training, a free Udacity course by Alice Boxall and Rob Dodson from Google. This is really good. This is something that we did in our team when we were getting started with accessibility. I really recommend it. I'm going to share the slides. I think they're up on the website. And if not, I'll share them later on Twitter so you can grab the URLs. It's free. It has like practical exercises. And yeah, this is what gave us our start. So both letting your team know kind of what's going to break, and then to know what to do about it. Kind of this provides some really good background. So we said earlier that tools like Pali cover will find some of your accessibility errors, but not everything. And it's actually those tools find like the easiest errors, like not having an alt or contrast, things like you can prove mathematically contrast is below a certain number. And the things that you can find automatically account for about 20 to 30% of the errors that you may have on your site. I kind of like this picture because it's kind of you've made it to a really important place. You've fixed a lot of things once you get to like 0 automatically detectable errors, but there's still a long way to go if you want your site to be truly accessible. So to get all the way to the top, you need like some human intervention. And this can be in the form of an external audit, which is kind of a team of experts that checks your site and kind of gives you a report on what may be broken from having tested it manually by experts. Customer research is basically just testing your site with real users with disabilities. And the third option is just learning how to use some of this assistive technology yourself. This is not mutually exclusive. Ideally, you should be doing all of them if you have the chance. And what I'll do is I'll just go over quickly through all these because we did all this in kind of different measures when we were making ft.com accessible and still today. So the first thing is getting some expert help. We were just getting started. We're just getting into grips with like what accessibility is and what we need to check for. We had a chance to work with the Digital Accessibility Centre, which is a non-profit in Wales that audited our site. And they put together a video of us, of their testers testing our site before we had fixed accessibility. So I'm just going to share that with you. Let's see, it's just a minute or two long. Let's see if we can hear.
My name is Rebecca Morgan. I have cerebral palsy. I test with voice activation and keep-it-only method. Choose 3. Pick button. The controls for the videos are not being picked up by Dragon.
My name is James O'Kane. I'm the Colour Contrast and Readability Analyst at the Digital Accessibility Centre, and today
on the homepage I encountered some text displayed on top of images. Text displayed on top of images can be quite difficult to read because of the varying colour contrast of the image behind the text.
My name is Ziad. I'm a website analyst at the DAC. I test using Zoom text with audible feedback. That's the assisted technology. I'm just going to scroll on down below and just demonstrate this.
Financial and career opinion. Markets. company's world. Oh.
So there's an empty space here, which would be an ideal place
Task FT.
to put the subheading.
My name is Jonathan Brew. I'm a cognitive analyst at the Digital Accessibility Center. There is a moving image that distracts me from all the content. Another issue I've found on the home page is the carousel. When navigating through it, I couldn't find the arrow to navigate through each page. And once I found it eventually, finding the other previous button was difficult.
Hello there, my name is Mike Jones. I'm completely blind and I'm a screen reader analyst for the Digital Accessibility Centre. On one of the articles I tested, there are several headings that announcers read more, and these also interrupt the article. It's not clear what the user will be reading more about. Further to this, these headings actually interrupt the main article that the user is reading. So it would have been helpful to me to ensure that the article read smoothly and continuously without interruptions.
All right, so this is just a 2-minute clip, but we actually spent the whole day there in their offices. And if you ever have the chance to do that, I highly recommend it because it will change your perspective forever and the way you look at the stuff that you build forever. So they did that audit on our site, and they produced about a 200-page report of all the errors that they found. And this is after we had run the automated test and gotten to like 0 errors. So we spent a couple months, a small team of us, fixing all these issues that came up. And once we basically fixed everything and they retested our site and found that we had gotten rid of all those errors, we got an official accreditation that we've just gotten again this year, kind of after a similar process, but instead of like 200, it was like 80 pages, so we're hopefully getting better. But back at the time when we got our very first one, we were very glad to get it because we were the first in the news industry, at least amongst like our competitors, to get one of them. But I remember kind of the feeling of kind of when you become like the fastest news website, like yes, we beat the rest, we're the best. But with this one, it was kind of different because it's really a title that you don't want to hold alone. So it's if there's one metric that we really should be all kind of trying to outdo each other on, it's this one. So yeah, if any of you work in the news industry or basically anything that we build, just trying to out accessibility each other is a really good thing. Another way to check for problems on your site, kind of at this level of kind of manual checks, is customer research. Because you may have all the theory right and you may have your accreditation in place, but you want your new features to be tested by actual users. So you might end up building something that looks good on paper and still get it horribly, horribly wrong, like that. And lastly, you can learn to use assistive tech yourself, and this is something that you can do for free. If you have a Mac, you have a lot of tools for free already that you can start using. These are some of the tools that we use to this day, or the FC.com team use, and what we used during our initial testing. VoiceOver for a screen reader, testing keyboard only, without a mouse and without a trackpad, and like the zoom capabilities of macOS. And I want to get into keyboard only because this one helped a lot in finding things like subtle things that were wrong. Because initially we were testing, like we knew we had to test without a mouse. So when it came time to test, we would like go on the page that we wanted to test and like put the mouse aside or like stop using the trackpad for a few seconds, like navigate with the keyboard, and then that's it. But what really made a difference was like going keyboard only all the time for everything. I kind of did that for a while, and this is what my setup looked like about a year and a half ago, because I realized that before throwing away my mouse, I had to kind of print out every shortcut for every app that I use. So it's like my top 5 apps was probably Chrome and Sublime and Slacker and stuff, and Gmail. And it kind of slows you down initially, but very quickly all that paper goes away and you kind of memorize the shortcuts, and you kind of accidentally become a power user. But then you quickly realize how the web is broken. Everything is broken. It was probably not that bad, but sites that I use every day, like Circle CI, I just could not use without a mouse. But you can quickly tell which sites have put some effort into accessibility. So for example, GitHub, I could get around GitHub fairly well once I knew the shortcuts without a mouse. I could do everything I did with a mouse without. Circle CI was a challenge, and I think it still is. And yeah, a couple of things. Slack has gotten better. Slack initially, if you didn't have a mouse, that's it. You could barely chat, but it's gotten better. So it not only helps you find issues in your product, but it gives you that it kind of puts you in someone else's shoes, kind of how the web really feels for people who don't have a choice and they have to use the keyboard. So if you ever have a chance to do this, I highly recommend it. It kind of changed my perspective in the way that I work. And I kind of learned a whole bunch of shortcuts and made me faster, so you win either way. To do this, I had like an external keyboard, that Mac keyboard that has the number pad on the right. So if I ever, when I was in Circle CI, kind of comes to mind where you actually needed to have a mouse. So my trackpad was disabled and I had no mouse. But if at some point there's something that you need to do with your pointer and you cannot do it in any other way, the number pad on that big keyboard can act as a pointer itself. It's very annoying, so you end up using it only when you have no other choice. But I used to carry that keyboard in my backpack back and forth, and it got old after a while. So it's like, okay, the keyboard says it work, and what I did was I made my trackpad very annoying. I removed all the goodies that Apple gave me. I made it very slow. Basically, I made it very uncomfortable to use, so that if I ever didn't have my big keyboard and I kind of forgot that I was supposed to use the keyboard on the laptop and went back to the trackpad, the fact that it was really uncomfortable made me remember and just go back to the keyboard. I don't know, if you ever get into it, I recommend that. So that really was lesson number 3. Throw away your mouse, or at least put it away while you test. There's a lot to be gained from testing your product with the keyboard only. So going back to this list of things that we had to fix, it's now that you've learned all the tools and you've set up your keyboard, it's very tempting to just roll up your sleeves and just try to fix everything yourself. But if I can recommend one thing, just don't do that. One thing that I learned, I want to say something I learned. It's something I learned pretty quickly, but it actually took me a while. Is that trying to fix everything on your own, if you're kind of the champion of accessibility in your team, is really not the right answer. Especially if you have a big team like we do at the FT, you're very likely to burn out. It's really inefficient, and you really are doing a disservice to your team, who are very likely to want to help if you just tell them what they're supposed to do. So rather than becoming a bottleneck, spend some time and some effort into raising awareness in your team and training your peers over just fixing everything yourself. So if you have that choice, you have just a set amount of time, and you say, I could fix all the issues in that set amount of time, don't. And spend some of that training other people, so that, otherwise the issues are just going to come back in, and it's just very frustrating. Another thing you can do is make it part of your recruitment process. And this is something that we did. This is our old kind of requirement-based job description, but we added it in there. We kind of added it at the bottom, and then kind of it crept its way to the top, and it really made a difference in the people that we hired. Oh boy, it's at -1. I'm out of time. Okay, put it in your job description, because it will influence the kind of the people that come into your team. And don't take everything on yourself. And I have some examples that I can chat to anyone out in the hallway if they're interested, about kind of a road show that we did, and kind of how it got people to use assistive tech kind of themselves for the first time. That was really good. So talking about it in your company at conferences like this one really helps. And I'm going to skip over this because I've run out of time. I don't quite know how that happened. I got very excited talking about stuff before. I can go into details about kind of if you need to raise a budget to do some accessibility stuff. And just to conclude, I want to take you back to how this all started for us at the FT. I was on bug duty one day and I saw that card that said integrate Pali into the process. And I didn't know what Pali was. And looking at the history, I saw that my colleague Ben Fletcher had raised that card. And Ben Fletcher at the time was a senior developer in FT.com, and now he's a principal engineer, kind of leads the team. He also happens to be deafblind. So just the fact that he prioritized that card help us all be aware of the fact that it's probably something that we should look into. So this is the last lesson that I want to leave you with, that diversity in your teams will improve your product, will improve your team, and will improve your life. So Ben's small action of kind of prioritizing that card snowballed into us building a better product, into our team learning about accessibility, and to me standing in front of you all here today when about a year ago I was terrified of public speaking. So yeah, diversity. Do it if you can. So to recap and to leave you with some things that you can do today, if you want it in under half an hour, Pali, play with it. Accessibility won't just magically happen, you just have to do something about it. Pali is a good place to start. That Udacity training course, if you share it with some of your teammates, they can kind of watch it on their own time. Throw away your mouse if you can, or put it away, learn some shortcuts, start using the keyboard more. Share the load and share all this knowledge with your teammates and beyond. So it's not just you kind of trying to fix everything. If you want to raise a budget, I'm happy to talk to you out in the hallway, kind of some good arguments to kind of pitch it to the business. And if you have a say on diversity in your team, prioritize it because it makes a big difference. So a while back, having this be the entrance of a public building probably would have been the norm. Now it's pretty much unthinkable. So don't wait until it becomes unthinkable to build inaccessible websites. The time to start making your site accessible is really now. So just go for it. Thank you.